What's up, world? Welcome back to I Mix What I Like right here at I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Happy to be your host. Do all of the things like, share, subscribe, support the channel, Patreon. Fascinating story in last week's Chronicle of Higher Education that involves a couple folks known around here. So let's check it out. Can Ibram Kendi find a new home at Howard? Christopher Rufo said the anti-racism scholar would no doubt find a receptive audience at the HBCU. This hasn't been the case so far. This was written by Jasper Smith, March 5th, 2025. And as you can see right out the gate, Greg Carr was teaching his class on the African roots of hip hop in January at Howard University when a colleague knocked on his door and flashed on his phone a headline. Ibram X. Kendi, the famed and polarizing anti-racist scholar and historian, would be joining Howard's faculty this summer to lead a new Institute of Advanced Study. My mouth fell open, said Carr, who has taught at Howard for 25 years. I came back into the room. The students were like, "What happened?" And I said, quite frankly, I'm not sure. Howard's administration didn't put Kendi's appointment up for a faculty vote or give the faculty any advance notice of the appointment. Anthony Wuto, Howard's provost, said an official confirmation process to hire Kendi would come later. The move upset some faculty and added to a long list of grievances towards administrators about pay, working conditions, and shared governance. Shared governance, the idea that faculty would have an input in the direction of the university, something we continue to struggle with throughout the university system, and in particular for those of us who teach in the state of Maryland, who have no right to collectively bargain. Dr. Kendi's appointment and his new institute are a continuation of the university's long history in study and scholarly research on the diasporic experience of Black and Brown people, the university wrote. But several faculty members who spoke to the Chronicle for this story, some of whom didn't want their names published, said that Kendi is using the university's brand to repair his tarnished image and that his theories on anti-racism conflict with theories taught by current faculty in the Afro-American Studies program. Resources given to start his new institute, they add, should instead be spent on long-standing programs. He's going to attract the fire. The institution will attract the fire, and we're going to have to deal with it, Carr said. I am up for a fight like that, but I am not up for a fight like that if it's going to turn into basically a celebrity rhetorical battle. Kendi, a Florida A&M University graduate, described his appointment to Howard as fulfilling a dream to teach in the same place as the Black intellectuals that have inspired him through his life. He reflected on his HBCU experience at a sparsely attended lecture event on racial equity at Howard last week, saying HBCU education was critical in shaping him as an academic. Teaching at Howard, he said, is like returning home. My whole career, I've not only studied those people, but I've also studied the ways in which they either came to or were trained at Howard, Kendi said, to a polite applause. To polite applause. And so for me, it's almost like coming full circle and to be able to sort of walk in their shoes. Kendi captured national attention during the 2020 George Floyd protests when his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, became a New York Times #1 bestseller. In 2020, Boston University hired him to lead a new center for anti-racist research. The center raised more than $50 million. He launched The Emancipator, a digital magazine on racial justice, and a COVID racial data tracker. 3 years later, donations slowed, and Kendi laid off 19 of his 36 staff members. Former colleagues accused Kendi of financial mismanagement and poor leadership. Pundits cast Kendi's tenure at BU in controversy. Pamela Paul, writing in the New York Times, expressed amazement that Kendi's strident, simplistic formula ever gained such prominence among academics. David DeCosimo, then a professor of philosophy at BU, took to the pages of the Wall Street Journal to argue that the problem wasn't so much Kendi as what his hiring had represented, a university turning a particular ideology into institutional orthodoxy. DeCosimo's op-ed was titled, How Ibram X. Kendi Broke Boston University. An internal audit conducted by BU found that Kendi did not mismanage the center's finances. The article says that Kendi's choice to leave Boston University was his own. He was not fired, and that his new agreement with Howard University includes a position for him as a professor in the history department and as director for this new Center of Advanced Study. Faculty members in the history department weren't included in the conversations surrounding Kendi's appointment, according to Wuto. We found out at the same time that the world found out, Joshua Myers, an associate professor of Africana Studies at Howard, wrote in an email to the Chronicle. This is consistent with most hiring of well-known figures. Indeed. This, I think, comes up a little bit later in this article, but this is an ongoing tension. A little bit we're feeling at Morgan, and it's not beef, and it has not as much to do, I think, with individual faculty being hostile in a certain way, but more in protecting their own fields and in some cases their own jobs. But the tension, and we have a version of it at Morgan where you get a new center, a new school created or new schools created with nominal positions. For instance, I'm nominally placed in the history department at Morgan, not because of celebrity. And no one in that department had anything to do with my being put there. It's again a nominal on paper thing. But really what I'm getting at is the ongoing tension is probably not the right word, but it's the one I'm stuck with right now between history and Black studies. This situation has this interesting overlap of a celebrity scholar being dropped in the history department without history being involved, but then also, as we're going to see, creating a kind of well, already it's been mentioned, a kind of tension with Black studies. What are the traditions of Black studies versus the tradition of anti-racist research? And never mind, as they talk about in here, where all these resources are coming from and going. So just interesting to note some of that. Some faculty members in the Afro-American Studies Department think Kendi's Institute of Advanced Study will conflict with the mission and scholarship of their own department. In 1968, a group of Howard students demanded that the university create courses in African American history, establish a more Black-focused curriculum university-wide, and realign its mission to serve the Black community at large. Students shut down the administrative building for 4 days until their demands were met. And invited to that 1968 beautiful Black Studies coup was, of course, the late, great Dr. James Turner, who would become the inaugural director of the Africana Studies and Research Center up there at Cornell University, where your boy got to spend 2 glorious intellectual years of my life. The protest redefined what it meant to be a Black university and resulted in the establishment of the Afro-American Studies Department. The goal of the department, Carr said, is to study the African diaspora outside the confines of traditional Western education, which typically begins teaching African history with the start of the slave trade.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
I'm telling you, when Carr is doing his Black Studies thing, he is peerless. Kendi's anti-racism scholarship is antithetical to that approach, argued Carr, the former chair of the Afro-American Studies Department. A framework overly focused on the struggle against white supremacy rather than the cultivation of Black traditions is at odds with the mission of Black Studies as conceived at Howard in the 1960s. This was the fight over the concept of the Black university, he said. The anti-racist work and all that stuff is not part of the broad arc of continuity between what students were demanding in the 60s and the birth of those Black studies programs. I'm telling you, this is bars. The anti-racist work and all that stuff is not part of the broad arc of continuity. Now, of course, I would have to throw in there, just as a reminder to our dear beloved master teacher, Dr. Carr, that part of the anti-racist stuff might not be part of that broad arc, but traditions left of the Democratic Party absolutely are part of that broad arc of continuity between what students were demanding in the 60s and the birth of those Black studies programs. So, but again, that's bars. Carr added that he thinks anti-racist work is important, but it is distinct from the purpose of Black studies, centering the global experiences and history of the African people. To this, Kendi disagrees. He believes that people, institutions, and ideas are either racist or anti-racist. Black studies isn't racist, he said, so therefore it is anti-racist. All right, but again, as I interpret what Dr. Carr is saying, Brother Kendi, is that to reduce that this is a reduction, to reduce Black studies to being anti-racist is what Carr is trying to say is, in fact, a reduction, an oversimplification, a narrowing, and a hyper focus on European and white people. That's not what Black studies is meant to be in its totality. What Carr said up here is exactly right. To study the African diaspora outside the confines of traditional Western education. Or as the author summarized his thoughts, that is exactly right. To say that Black studies is anti-racist so that it can conform to Kendi's framework for the purposes of his advanced study is again a reduction and even a disrespect to what Black or Africana studies is, has been, and should be. I've never made the case that anti-racism is for white people, Kendi said in an interview, to recognize that you can have a top scholar who would want to come to Howard because of its eminence and because of its history and because of what it has to offer. That's what it means to be anti-racist. Ooh, top scholar. Ooh, 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 ooh. I don't know. I feel like could have been a little bit of humility in that. But okay, but that's what it means to be anti-racist. I'm also excited about using the platform of the Institute to elevate the work of faculty and students who are doing racial justice work, Kendi said. I guarantee you that was part of uh his interview, his job interview, or what he submitted in any sort of, if there even was a sort of job statement. Although, as the article says here, the president of Howard had been sort of recruiting Kendi since 2019, so he may not have had to explain all of that. But that's definitely a line from the job hunt. We're going to elevate the work of my colleagues, ultimately for it to be a place where those faculty and students who are engaging in this research could find support and community. So again, this. So I know this comes up later in the article. I just can't help but get to it to make the point here that, man, I would have so much preferred if Kendi said, "Bring me in and let's create, even if we need to call it a center for the purposes of funding, let's create this within Black studies." As he says of himself, as a top scholar, he has to be aware of the landscape and the threat, especially today, for Black studies. He has to recognize the important tradition that Black studies represents. And boy, that would have been fly if he had come in there and said, I don't need my own separate institute. Let's build something within this Black studies. Come in there, get your professor, come in there with your tenure, your professor. I note that Carr is still described here as an associate professor, as was Professor Myers, which is a little confusing to me, but sure, come on in with your professor title and your tenure and your fat paycheck, but bring that money and that focus and that collegiality into Black studies. That would have been so fly. Because sure, as it says here, for the university, which regained Research One status last month, spending from the Institute of Advanced Study will help the university maintain Carnegie classification in years to come. Whereas the president says we're conducting research that is interdisciplinary and is of the highest quality. That is exactly what Africana and Black studies is: an interdisciplinary, high quality research producing field. So you could have been the Institute for Advanced Black Study or Advanced African Diaspora Study within the Afro-American. Oh, that would have been fly. That would have been fly. Faculty have been fighting with the university for years for more resources, governance, and better pay and working conditions. The university has had several recent high-profile hires, including journalists like Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ta-Nehisi Coates, as well as actress Felicia Rashad as a former dean, that inflamed tensions on campus in 2021. 2 days after Howard announced Coates and Hannah Jones would join Howard's faculty, a faculty member under the pseudonym Imani Light, if folks remember, we covered that here, wrote an open letter to Hannah Jones outlining the university's treatment of full-time, non-tenured faculty. Each year, Howard professors working as lecturers earn salaries which are the lowest among peer and aspirational peer institutions, Light wrote. Lecturers who hold doctorates from the most rigorous programs in the nation earn $48,000 a year at Howard, less than a first-year kindergarten teacher in Washington, D.C. public schools who holds a bachelor's degree and just graduated in May of 2021. Wow. Howard has since reached an agreement with the faculty union that boosted their pay. In 2021, Howard's board voted to remove faculty, alumni, and student positions from the Board of Trustees. A 3-year legal battle involving faculty representation on the board reached the District of Columbia Superior Court in December. If you're going to bring Ibram Kendi to Howard or to any HBCU, whatever resources you're going to devote to him should be distributed throughout the faculty and the learning enterprise, Carr said. I don't think that's going to happen, but I have no way of knowing. We all want to find out together. Again, Carr is bars here. That's exactly correct. And it would have been super dope, especially if the story is at all accurate. If Kendi left Boston University to the surprise of the university without being fired, meaning you have time and choices. If you know the president at Howard has been recruiting you since 2019, this doesn't come across. Again, I don't know the man, I'm not in his pockets, but this doesn't come across as a move of desperation that is imposed on so many faculty, even other top scholars. So there were deals to be made. There was room to wiggle within. There was a chance to make a kind of splash that goes beyond that which occurs in your own bank account. Other faculty members said that Kendi's hiring could bring unwanted attention from conservatives to the university, which is reliant on federal funding. Christopher Rufo, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute who has advised the Trump administration, has called Kendi a shallow grifter whose ideas have lost influence. Kendi will no doubt find a receptive audience at Howard, but he will no longer enjoy the unqualified adoration of America's prestige institutions or be asked to lead privilege walks at Fortune 100 corporate retreats, Rufo wrote. Is that true that he did that? Privilege walks? Even more to my point, the hate that Rufo represents in this society would have been intensified. He would have been more hurt if Kendi came in to Howard in the way that Carr or even I am suggesting to a certain degree. When Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall were doing work to help dismantle Jim Crow education, they weren't necessarily the most popular of individuals, but Howard had to be a place where that work could be done, Wuto said. If not Howard, then where? This part was funny to me. The author here, hold on. Look, I just claim it. Jasper Smith. Look at how Jasper ends this article here. Look at Jasper. Shout out to Jasper Smith. Look at how she ends this here. HU, a man in the audience yelled to Kendi, expecting the time-honored call and response. Shout out HU, Kendi replied. The anticipated answer, hung in the air.
Let's try that again.
1, 2, 3.
HU,
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.